Think about how products usually sell themselves. They explain, they justify, they list features. They try to prove they're worth your money. Now imagine launching a game console and refusing to do any of that. No specs, no diagrams, no reassurance. In the 1990s, when video games were still trying to prove they belonged, that should have failed. But instead, it reshaped the entire industry. So what did Sony see that every other console maker was still getting wrong? For most of gaming's early history, explanation wasn't optional. It was expected. After the North American video game crash of 1983, the industry didn't just lose money, it lost trust. Retailers were burned, parents felt misled, and video games were treated as unreliable. So in the late 80s and early 90s, companies didn't just explain their games, they explained everything. Nintendo ads showed controller diagrams, labeled screenshots, and step-by-step explanations of what made a game better. Not just, this is fun, but here's why it's fun, and here's how it works. Sega leaned even harder into shorthand, blast processing, side-by-side comparisons, aggressive performance claims. If Nintendo was teaching the class, Sega was shouting the answers. And then there were numbers, 8-bit, 16-bit, 64-bit. Those numbers weren't aimed at engineers, they were aimed at consumer confidence. You didn't need to know what a bit was, just that more of them sounded better. They became shorthand that said, this is progress, trust us. And for a while, that shortcut worked, until everyone started using it. This is the part that often gets reduced to console war debates, but it's about how the industry actually worked. Nintendo's most important achievement in North America wasn't Mario, it was control. Nintendo controlled how many games publishers could release, who was allowed to publish at all, and how games were packaged, how they were presented to the public. The seal of quality wasn't just a logo, it was an assurance system. Even the name Nintendo Entertainment System was chosen deliberately to avoid the stigma attached to the words video game. Nintendo treated video games less like toys and more like appliances you could trust. By the early 1990s, that strategy had paid off. Games were back in homes. Retailers were no longer afraid to stock them. Parents weren't questioning the category itself. And once trust is rebuilt, explanation stops being necessary. Between 1985 and 1995, the NES audience aged by roughly a decade. The kids who grew up with Mario were now teenagers, college students, young adults with disposable income. In other words, not kids anymore. You can see this shift everywhere. Gaming magazines became less toy catalog and more lifestyle focused. Arcades declined, but home gaming deepened. Games themselves grew longer, darker, and more complex. Most importantly, players stopped asking, are games legitimate? That question had already been answered. Instead, they asked, does this fit who I am now? And that was the perfect time for Sony's strategy to make the most sense. Sony did not name the console after a spec. They didn't call it PlayStation 32 or PlayStation Ultra, anything that explained its power. They also didn't lead their marketing with technobabble. Compared to the surrounding context, that was unusual. Just 1 year earlier, Atari had marketed the Jaguar almost entirely around being 64-bit. And when the games didn't visibly deliver on that promise, the number itself didn't just disappoint, it became a punchline. Nintendo watched this happen and responded by doubling down. They named their next console the Nintendo 64. Now Sony watched all of this, and instead of competing on explanation, they chose not to compete at all. Their advertising focused on mood, sound, abstract imagery, identity, often with almost no explanation attached. Now this wasn't neglect, it was a bet a bet that explanation had already done its job. Sony assumed the audience no longer needed to be convinced that games mattered, only which system they belonged to. You can see this assumption baked directly into the hardware. The original PlayStation is minimalist, industrial, visually consistent with Sony's audio and video equipment. It looks like something that belongs next to a stereo, not wedged between action figures. This wasn't accidental. Sony was a consumer electronics company first, and the PlayStation followed the same design language as their CD players and AV components. No bright colors, no mascots, no need to reassure anyone. There was no need to soften the message, because Sony wasn't asking for permission. They assumed the audience didn't need convincing anymore. Now, this part matters because it prevents the wrong takeaway. Sony's strategy does not work in every era. If Sony launched a console in 1985 this way, retailers wouldn't have trusted them, parents wouldn't have understood them, and silence would have felt reckless, not confident. Sony succeeded because Nintendo absorbed the risk of rebuilding trust. Sega normalized edgier content, so the audience no longer needed convincing. Sony didn't replace Nintendo and Sega's work, but they did inherit the result. Silence only reads as confidence after explanation has already done its job. Recognizing that moment and acting on it was the key to Sony's success. During the fifth generation, Sony wasn't operating in a vacuum. They were directly up against gaming's two major players of the era, Sega's Saturn and the Nintendo 64. But both competitors were still speaking the old language. Sega marketed the Saturn as advanced hardware, but struggled to explain or show how that power even mattered. Nintendo went even further. They didn't just explain the power, they named the console after it, Nintendo 64. It was a direct appeal to the old rule: bigger number equals better system. But by the mid-90s, numbers had stopped predicting the outcome. Meanwhile, Sony never asked players to compare specs. They let the contrast emerge naturally. PlayStation ads didn't say, "We're more powerful." They let players discover the difference themselves. Sony forced the comparison to happen in players' hands, not on paper. Instead of asking which console is more powerful, players started asking which one feels like it has more going on. And that was a comparison Sony consistently won. While Nintendo and Sega were still arguing the old rules, Sony was already playing a different game. Once Sony proved this worked, not just culturally, but competitively, the industry adjusted. The fifth generation exposed the limits of explanation-based marketing. By the time the next generation arrived, bit counts faded from branding, specs moved to press releases instead of commercials, and experience became the new headline. Dreamcast sold immediacy, PlayStation 2 sold scale and identity, Xbox framed itself as a powerful media hub. None of them tried to teach consumers why games mattered anymore. That question had already been answered. So this isn't really a story about Sony versus Nintendo versus Sega. It's a story about how industries mature. Early on, explanation builds trust. Later, assumption signals confidence. Nintendo taught people to believe in video games again. Sega showed they could appeal to a much broader audience. And Sony? Well, Sony made clear that video games no longer needed to explain themselves. Now I'd like to hear from you. Was there a moment when video games stopped feeling like they needed to be justified for you? Was it with the PlayStation, a specific game, or maybe just a moment when you realized you didn't need anyone else's approval to enjoy them? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and happy gaming, my friends.